All right, looks like we're getting started. Wow, that's loud and echoey. Good to see everybody here. I feel like I know probably half the room, maybe a little bit more, but see some old faces I haven't seen in a while, so good to say hello. Yeah, so the title of my talk, Deb, who runs the conference, always likes me to make it something controversial, but why so few education companies break out and what to do about it. I think this came from a conversation we were having about how there are so few really, really big winners in education, and at the same time, education is still so broadly broken as a whole. I think there are very few incredibly impressive institutions, very few incredibly impressive products with great outcomes. And so we're talking about why that was, as opposed to other industries. And I think, to start with, I think about K12. I don't spend my time in K12 very much, but my wife actually, when we first got married, was an elementary school teacher. So I got to view that from I guess the sidelines a little bit. Her starting salary her first year was $17,000 a year, plus benefits. And watching through her eyes, it made me realize that she basically just had an impossible task ahead of her. Outside of funding concerns, which she actually taught in the same school district I grew up in, which is one of the poorest school districts in the US, not just because of it was low income, but also big families, and the two of those things don't combine very well. But I mean, I watched her, they had to ration their paper that they would use, and she was a third grade teacher, so they did everything on a fourth of a sheet of paper, double-sided. And she would have to plan out all of her assignments so that they worked on the right paper the right way, so if you cut it out, you could use the front end for one side and the back side for another. But funnily enough, inside that district when I was there, it was just as poor when I was in it, all the way through in elementary school to public high school. When I was a junior in high school, I was in an AP literature class, which was awesome that we had, and our teacher walked in with a giant, fancy touchscreen projector that was clearly really expensive, and the year after I left, everybody in the school got free Chromebooks. And so we started asking, well, why is that the case? Turns out there was somebody at some level that decided they wanted to give a big technology grant to the school, and I love technology as much as anybody, but those funds had to be used for technology. So I think, the long and short of it is in K-12, asset allocation is very difficult. It's inherently political. And so when I talk to, I invest in startups on the side, and I talk to a lot of education companies, and a lot of K-12 education companies have a business model that is based on selling to those school districts. That is an incredibly difficult sale. If you have teachers rationing paper, kind of doesn't matter what your SaaS does, nobody really cares. And funnily enough, the craziest thing in the world to me is the K-12 companies that are B2B that have really broken out go direct to the teachers first. So really the only way to get a beachhead in that market is to go direct to the people making $40,000 a year and having them pay out of pocket, and after a while you can guilt the district into covering some of that. And that's basically how K-12 works. That is pretty difficult. I'm also an investor in a few companies. And the obvious reaction to that is, well, does everybody have to go to a public school? What about the private school system? What exists there? And there are a few things, I've invested in a couple of companies that are really, really exciting, but they basically have to not touch the existing school system at all and go create a completely separate path. So one company, Prenda, does micro schools where there's kind of parent that helps, or someone who's a teacher who helps teach a micro school of 8 people. And the crazy thing when you work out the economics of that is far less expensive, on the order of 1/5 the cost per student as the public school is. So that, I don't know, there's interesting stuff there. But that's we started this conversation asking why there are so few K12 education companies that make it. It's a really hard space. And then where I spend far more of my time is in higher ed, in post-secondary education. For those of you that have never met me or heard about us before, I started a school called the Bloom Institute of Technology. It used to be known as Lambda School, so you may have heard of that instead. And I am a dropout myself. I was going to what was, in retrospect, one of the cheapest schools in the United States for college. I think my tuition was $6,000 a year. And I felt like I wasn't getting enough value out of that, so I dropped out. I moved to Silicon Valley. I lived in a car while I taught myself to code. I broke into tech and eventually found myself going back to the small town that I had moved from to do that, and talking to people there. And the conversation would usually go like, okay, that's really cool. I mean, you're making a 6-figure salary. And people didn't realize that 6 figures in San Francisco is not the same as 6 figures other places, but we'll dance around that. So how can I do what you did? And I pretty quickly found that telling someone who is making $25,000 a year working at a gas station to take out $100,000 plus of student loans and go to a 4-year institution wasn't a difficult sell. I felt like I couldn't morally or ethically recommend that. And that's, I'm sure net, if someone were to go get a CS degree and graduate and do really well, the ROI is actually there. I mean, you can calculate that. There was a study that the Higher Ed Funding Institute put out a few months ago that talks about, they did a net ROI calculation for every single degree that has the data in the United States. What they found was about 75% of the degrees produced a positive ROI. So that's not, probably bad that 25% are producing a negative ROI. But then if you dive in and look at the math on how they do that, they take the expected increase in earnings per student, assume that student will earn that amount for 40 years, and then if that amount, the increased income over the lifetime of earnings of the student, is greater than the cost of tuition, they say that is a positive ROI. I don't know the right way to calculate positive ROI, but I would not calculate it quite that way. Obviously that neglects interest. Obviously that assumes that, it ignores the time you spend in work. And so I went back and ran our ROI math on that. Our average student has an ROI in 1 year, not 40 years. So when we started Bloom Tech, we started with kind of a single goal, and that was to make education, and starting out in the high-tech space, outcomes-based. And when I say outcomes-based, we started off, like most other code boot camps, 3 months long, $10,000, and the entirety of the idea was, we're just gonna take this and put it online. And that was it. And it was me and my co-founder, and we said, hey, if we have 100 students a year, and we charge each, so that's 25 students every 3 months, we charge each of them $10,000, that's $1 million a year. We can each take home $500,000 a year, and we'll not hire anybody else, and that's exactly what we were doing. And we're doing that successfully for a few months. Along the way, to drive interest in the school, we taught a bunch of free classes, and just to kind of get our name out there. We had no outcomes to speak of. Nobody had ever heard of us before. And I started spending my time talking to students about what they were looking for, what they wanted. And almost invariably, the conversation went something like this. Hey, it looks like you're doing really well in our free classes. You seem to have a proclivity for coding. This seems like a solid career path for you. I don't know, I have no data on this, but why don't you pay us $10,000 and do the full thing? And invariably the response was, because I don't have $10,000, you idiot. That's why I'm trying to learn to code. And when that happened, I think, kind of a light bulb went off in my mind, and I realized that the ROI, and before that, I worked in lending as my first job when I was a programmer. The ROI calculus shouldn't be entirely on the student's shoulders. The school should understand the market much better than the student. The school should understand success rates much better than the student. The school should understand costs much better than a student. It's just not a reasonable thing to expect someone coming in cold to understand all of the data the same way that a school would. And so that makes you think, why do schools not hold any of that risk? I tend to tweet controversial things from time to time, but last night, as you may know, they extended the student loan deferment, repayment date, whatever they call that, for a little bit, and all the politicians and activists were talking about, let's cancel student loans. There's a particular tweet that said, these student loans are the most predatory loans that have ever existed, and they need to be canceled. And my question when I see that is, regardless of how you feel about canceling student loans, if those loans are that predatory, why are we making them? If all student loans are predatory, should we stop making student loans? And the response is, well, you're saying that only rich people should have access to an education that enables you. So clearly, there's some bifurcation there between loans that are good and loans that are bad. And there's enabling education, and then there's mistakes that can end up harming a lot of people. And so we started out by saying, all right, what if instead of paying for our school up front, what if you paid us $1,000? And then if you end up with a job that pays more than $50,000 after this, you pay us the rest. And we were, still just the two of us, and we didn't spend very much money, so we could afford to run experiments like that. And pretty quickly, we discovered that there was about 10 times the amount of interest in that versus our school overall. And so that, having dropped out of college myself, having come from a really low-income community, that completely makes sense to me. It is really easy to make an investment if you know that the ROI will be positive and if the downside risk is covered by somebody. And then we said, all right, that's $1,000 up front. What if we said it's going to be completely, $0 up front? You don't have to spend anything out of pocket. And I went around and I talked to other code boot camps and said, why don't you guys do this? They said, A, because all of our revenue, we have to pay the bills, so we need revenue to come in up front. And B, you're crazy. You're crazy to do something that's entirely online. You're crazy to do something that has $0 up front from the student. That's the only way we know whether a student is really serious and committed, and it just won't work. And they were kind of right for a while, honestly. We had to get really good at determining intent of students and determining if a student would be able to get hired. Now we have, and then at the same time, we added an extra 3 months to the curriculum because when I was hiring from code boot camps, nobody knew enough. And then I would talk to other code boot camps and say, why don't you teach this? Why don't you teach the very basics of data science? Why are people trying to get hired the first time they've written an app ever? And they said, well, in order to make our economics work, we need to turn over this classroom 4 times a year. And we can't really charge more than $10,000 or people stop paying. So that's what the business model is. It wasn't driven by employer demand. It wasn't driven by what the proper length of curriculum was. It was driven by market realities. And that market has been solved for in some ways by the government once you get into Title IV. The trade-off of Title IV is that means you have to be, generally speaking, at least 4 years long. That means you have to teach a very set of curriculum. You can't make changes. You can't skew from any of that, which does not make sense in the technology world. That we are changing our curriculum. We're tweaking it every day. We will do bigger rewrites every year or two as technology changes a little bit. The fundamentals are still the same, but some of the features and some of the language and some of the tooling has to change along the way if you want to do what employers want. I also think it's interesting that every skill that someone would want to learn, every topic, is taught in exactly the same amount of time. Why is every undergrad degree 4 years long? Why is there not something that's 3 years long? Why is there not something that's a year? Why is there, and there are obviously post-grad degrees that go longer than that. But we set out with a goal, and I feel like the only real way to have a breakout education company in higher ed or in post-secondary is to switch what people are buying. So when people go to the Bloom Institute of Technology, we call it Bloom Tech, they're not buying curriculum. They're not buying support. They're not even buying skills. They're buying income. They're buying a path to making more money. And so we can actually guarantee that. We've worked with a company called Ascent to create something called an outcomes-based loan, where a student pays nothing out of pocket. They don't make any payments until they have a job offer that is for more than $50,000 a year. And then after you do get that job offer, it's a pretty low payment. It's depending on interest, and check the site that explains it all, but $500 to $600 a month. So basically, if we can increase a student's income by $10,000 a year, the education has already paid for itself. And we can increase in income by $10,000 a year just in our career coaching negotiation phase. We could help people get raises for $10,000 a year without leaving their jobs and be net positive in many instances. But when you operate from the back to the front, it changes what you're selling. It changes what the student is buying. And when we launched with that model, about 100, more than that internationally, other schools tried to adopt the same model. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 still standing with that model. And when we first started doing it, we said the value prop here is that if a school can't provide that, it will have to go out of business. If it can't reliably provide the ROIs that every school is telling every student that it can definitely provide, then it won't work. And you have to actually put your money where your mouth is. Turns out it's really, really, really hard to do that. And it's now, I haven't done the math on how much we spent, but Almost $100 million, probably more than $100 million in total research, development, building product, building systems that actually get people hired until it works. And it looks like hiring the best instructional designers in the world. It looks like meticulous attention to data, even though our data can be broken and messy sometimes. But that is really what it takes to produce outcomes. And it turns out that outcomes are actually the difficult part of education. It is, regardless of where the funding comes from, I don't care whether it is taxpayer funded, government funded, free for the student, paid for by the student. The difficult thing is producing outcomes. And unless the incentives are there, there's just no way it's going to happen. I remember there are a few specific times where we looked at something and I could sense in the back of my mind that if our incentives weren't, we have to figure out how to make this work, we would have said, you know what, we're doing a really good job and we are trying really hard, and if a student is not successful, that's on them. We have done everything we possibly can. And each time I've had that thought, we've found something where, actually if we change the way our career coaches are working with students so that it starts happening in the school, and it might cost a couple of $1 million to make that happen, it starts to work. And then, maybe, and now we look at one of our key metrics that predicts placement is the percentage of each graduating cohort that has an interview within 30 days. The reason we do that is because we found that if students aren't getting interviews, then they tend to give up. And it would be really easy for an educational institution to say, you know what, people gave up. If they would have kept trying, they definitely would have been hired. And I actually do think that's true, by the way. But that doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter how big our hearts are or how much we would like for those students to be successful. What really matters is if you can produce the results. So, we tasked a team with that single metric of, highly paid people for a year, actually multiple years of just let's get people interviews. And now it's working. It was not automatic or overnight, and it took a really long time. So, going back to, and we're going to do a brief Q&A, even though the organizers don't like it when I do a Q&A, so I have to make sure to repeat your question back to you. But I think if you're going to actually build a model that works outside of the existing university model, outside of Title IV, which I think is a requirement to make the education what the student actually needs, as opposed to what the accreditation requirements require. To have a breakout in that space, you really have to go all in, and you have to invest a ton of money, and you have making it so that people with no upfront payment show up at your door and you find the right ones and get them placed it's difficult, but it is so powerful when it happens. I was looking at some of our stats that were a little bit old, but our median student after placement increased their salary by $45,000 a year. Our graduates as a whole are now making more than $100 million per year on top of what they were making before they attended our school. And every single day we have a channel in our Slack that's called Hired, and it's probably my favorite thing in the world. Every single day you get to see a half dozen, a dozen people. We have a bot that pops up as soon as an offer comes in, so we get to watch the offers flow in in close to real time. And then often we encourage students to take a picture of themselves with their offer letter and share their story. And some of the stories are just the most incredible, remarkable things that I promised myself that I would get desensitized to it over time, and thousands of students later, I still have not. The thing about shifting people's incomes is you really only have to do it once, and that changes generations forever. So if you take someone who was earning minimum wage and you help them move themselves really to 6 figures, that not only affects them, that affects their children and their children's children, and it changes everything. And that's what education companies can do when executed properly. I think that's why we're all here. That's why we're interested in education, not only in income increases necessarily, but education is one of the most powerful tools to change the world for the better. So I think it's not easy to have an education company that can affect change at scale. And we're going to be launching something in the next month that I think is probably the biggest thing we've ever launched in that way. But it is the most rewarding thing I could possibly imagine. And I am just grateful to be a part of it, and grateful to play even a tiny role in the impact that we get to see. So we're going to open it up to, we've got 12 minutes of Q&A, and you'll have to yell your question, and I'll have to repeat it back so that it can hit a live stream. Yeah? Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about needing to get pretty good at finding out if people are serious and hireable. Can you talk a little bit more about what you use to determine that?
Yeah, there's some stuff that we don't share for proprietary reasons, but at a high level, what we need to solve for is twofold. One is the ability to learn the things that we need them to learn. That's intellectual ability at the pace that we're moving. And so there are things that we do to select for that. And then the other one is kind of a work barrier. So you don't want to have a really convoluted student funnel coming. You want the user experience to be great. But generally speaking, if you have the student or the prospective student do a little bit of work, and you see if they do that and how they do that, that tells me more than any credential, any GPA, any test score ever. And it can be a really, 4 or 5 hours worth of work. And the binary of do you do it or not is one thing, and then how well do you do it is another. Can be difficult to measure, but those are the two things that we select for. Yeah.
As we look at the number of the students who come into your program, and why were they in the position they were in? What would have been done with their trajectories when they were in high school or earlier to move their trajectory in a different direction?
It varies a lot. I think a lot of it is purely circumstantial. A lot of what you decide to do directly post high school is a result of who you're surrounded by when you're making those decisions. It's crazy now. I look back to, when I went to school, I was one of the. I had a friend group where we all took the ACT and the SAT, but a lot of my peers just did not. And it wasn't because they they just didn't think about it and didn't know about it and weren't thinking about going to college. I think now the the drumbeat is pounding really loudly when you're in high school that the entire purpose is go to college, go to college, go to college. Sometimes the student's detriment. But then our median student is actually a little bit older. Last I checked, our median age was right around 31. And so about half of our students have a degree already. So a lot of people, they went to college, they were doing all the right things, and they ended up in a career path that they were just stuck. And there are students who are, working at fast food or in retail, making minimum wage when they attend. So there's a spectrum. And there are different things that you have to teach people depending on, what their experience has been in life. But I guess the short answer is it varies. But on average, we have a small cohort of 18, 19-year-olds who are opting out of college, coming to us instead. But on average, it's someone who is in a career path and just wants to accelerate where they are. And it helps that we're moving people into tech, which is really the highest paying career path that's reliably out there. And especially, it's kind of an accident of history that you can change somebody's income by $50,000 a year in 6 months. That has not, if you look historically, that's never really been possible before outside of somebody starting a business. So I think we're in a really lucky place and time to be able to do that. Yeah.
So hi, Austin. This is Tony, and just kudos to whatever you're doing. I used to be training counselor in college, and I was training one student to take 100 hours. So I'm just curious, during the scale process, what are the key leading practices in terms of technology, people, and process, so when you scale, but you can still keep the high quality coaching for the student?
Yeah. So the question was, how do you keep a high quality process as you scale? We kind of started out by saying, let's scale humans, right? We need N career coaches for every Y students. And that works for a while, but you find that managing that many distinct connections just kind of increases the likelihood that something breaks. I guess the short answer is you use as much product and technology as you can, and then you use human touch where human touch is necessary. I've talked to people who believe that teachers are going to no longer be needed and coaches are going to be replaced by AI. I love driving my Tesla, but it can't even drive on its own. And I think we're a long ways away from AI tutor being really effective. Sign me up when it's there. I would love it, but it's not, and I don't think it will be for a long time. That said, technology is really good at understanding where a student is, helping a student know where they need to be, helping them understand what they should be working on next. Technology is better at that than humans. So you kind of build the technology to guide the student there and then have human help when the human help is the right fit. Yeah.
Do you find that the students that come to you with a college degree end up getting a higher salary on average?
So that's a really good question. The question was, do you find that students with a college degree end up getting a higher salary on average? I'd have to look at the data. I believe the answer is yes, but very slightly. Nowhere near and some of that is, there's selection bias, obviously, in who has a degree versus who does not just the credential of, did you go to college? But I remember last I looked, it's pretty small. I'm looking at my data team out here. Less than $5,000 a year delta between the two. I will say that we started in 2016, 2017. That was the conversation I had every single day with somebody is, if I don't have a degree, can I make it? If I don't have a CS degree specifically, can I make it? We have, it's roughly 50-50 of degree holders and non-degree holders. And we have people without degrees at every major tech company you can imagine. Really outside of, I think of a couple of companies and defense contractors. Everybody else kind of doesn't care at this point. And that's really not, when we're talking to hiring partners and also prospective students, it's just not a conversation we have anymore. It's not the main thing. The main thing is, can you build stuff? Can you write code? Can you analyze data? And so on average, it is easier for somebody with a degree from the right institution to get interviews, but we can go around all those processes. There are better ways to get interviews than just submitting cold applications anyways. So different students may rely more on cold submitting resumes versus other tactics, but it's not the important thing. Yeah.
So given that you're in the STEM field, you think outcomes, you're sensitive to the K-12 from your own wife's perspective. That's great. I love what you're throwing at here. So have you thought, do you have ideas in your head about how we would improve K-12 system for getting more students engaged, inspired, coming outcome, and after STEM education? We worry about that pipeline. It's actually big breaking. It's like it knows.
Yeah. So the question was, it's awesome that we're doing STEM education kind of post-secondary, but what about before then? What about K through 12? I think you're totally right. One of our investors runs a program called K12 which is it's a nonprofit that tries really, really hard to get K through 12 students into some form of tech. I've invested in a couple of companies that are trying to do that. I think, I would love for it to make more sense for us to approach the K-12 market, and we may be doing some, free stuff in the future where, if you're under 18, there's regulatory and legal risk associated with all of that, or we would probably be throwing the doors open more. But yeah, I think there is, I'm not a believer that everybody needs to work in tech or everybody needs to be a programmer, but I think it's, when I look out at the people that work at our company, it is so incredibly valuable if someone even understands technology enough to know what's under the hood, what's breaking, what's not. Even, I wish I wrote code all day. I don't write code anymore. But yeah, just I don't want to say the literacy, because it's not a binary thing, but it certainly helps if you understand, and that's kind of the way the world is working more and more. So would love to find, the more students that are well-versed in tech and STEM generally, not just tech, in K-12 it's a huge advantage in all of life, really. Yeah.
There's a lot of course, higher institutions now that are going on the certificate game for professionals or otherwise to create more affordable pathways for people that want to have this kind of education. How do you think about companies like yours or startups that are really outcomes oriented but see themselves as competing now against even higher ed that's going into a similar space and offering certificate-based programs?
Yeah. So the question was, what about people that are offering certificate-based programs? I don't think about us as so certificates are a tricky thing, because I've never seen any real certificate matter to employers broadly outside of a degree. I think that's just a tricky problem to solve. But I do think about the great thing about starting out in tech and in programming is it's very, very measurable. You can whether it's the best measure or not, you can throw a code challenge at somebody and see if they pass it. That's more difficult to measure in other fields, but I think I would hope that in the future a lot of places are offering micro-skilling or different types of skilling on top of a monolithic 4 years when you're 18 years old. And the market for that is obviously outrageously big. So yeah, I think we're out of time, but thanks for letting me chat.